Thanks so much, Sheila. And thanks everyone for attending. I wanted to introduce to you my research and partly my clinical journey going through cardiovascular research, leveraging big data and biomedical engineering. So the outline of my talk is fairly simple in that I want to really briefly go over my approach to big data, talk about how we use big data in clinical and health services research, and finally, how big data could be leveraged with biomedical engineering to bring our findings to the bedside. So we can't do the name lecture without first talking about the guy who gave his name to the lecture. So Dr. Earl Winand is actually a Canadian cardiac anesthesiologist. He was a former chair of anesthesia at the University of Ottawa. And he is actually now in his 90s. And that's partly the reason why many of us have not heard of him. So back in the 1970s, he was the president of the Canadian Anesthesiology Society. And back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, he was consecutively the chair of the SCA, or the Society of Cardiovascular Anesthesiologists, for 3 years in a row. What's very notable about Dr. Winans is that throughout the latter half of his career, he was actually combating progressive visual loss to the point that he was legally blind for perhaps the last 5 years of his clinical career. And he was the first one in the country to establish a assistant program that's officially there to help out with physicians with a disability. And so Dr. Winans, during the latter part of his career, was actually relying a lot on residents and anesthesia assistants to be his eyes in the operating room, and was still able to deliver very high quality care to his patients. He's known for his contributions to cardiac anesthesia through his research in coronary artery disease and anesthesia, as well as being one of the founding members of simulation medical education in Canada. And so I actually had the privilege of meeting Dr. Winans in person on several occasions throughout my career. And I was each time very struck by his kindness, his generosity, and most of all, his belief in himself and others, and his willingness to be persistent and never give up on anything that he set his eyes on. And that's the inspiration that I had for my own career. So this part will be a little bit quicker. So a little bit about myself. I'm a bit of an unconventional researcher in that I'm an engineer turned epidemiologist slash biostatistician. The first little bit of medical school, I wasn't really sure why I was in medicine, but very quickly, as soon as I discovered cardiac anesthesia, I realized that's something I wanted to do, perhaps in second year of medical school. And that's because I found a big link between engineering and cardiac anesthesia. It's a lot about circuitry, fluid mechanics, as well as the physical part of physics that I was naturally strong at. I adored critical medicine. And for the first half of my career, I did a fair bit of ICU in the cardiovascular world. What I really like about critical care is that it's actually a real physiology lab in which, life physiologic events really happen. You know immediately the results of your intervention. And more importantly, that's where big data is born. And that's something I really enjoy working with. So I took a bit of a non-traditional path in that I started as a full-time clinician, and I would say for the first half of my career, I had been a full-time clinician. I was always about at least 90% clinical during that time. I was raised or mentored along with a group of cardiologists and cardiac surgeons. So initially, my research wasn't entirely anesthesia related, but that also gave me a really broad perspective in my clinical thinking and in terms of my formulation research ideas. And it made me very comfortable working with interdisciplinary group of people. And so finally, I ended up stumbling in this field of big data and cardiovascular research. And that's what I really enjoy doing aside from clinical practice. So So next up, let's really delve into the big data part. And over the years, I realized that this is an approach that somehow I had developed in working with big data. But first of all, what is big data? So big data is an accumulation, and this is actually a Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. So let's see what it says. It's an accumulation of data that's too large and complex for processing by traditional database management tools. I actually have an expanded version of this talk just to talk about what data is, which I will spare you um, during this presentation. But so traditionally, there are three V's that we use to describe big data. But since that, we've invented many other V's to describe it. And so volume, velocity, and variety are the three V's here. There are many types of data that we encounter on a daily basis in research and in practice. Um, this is no means an exhaustive list, but it is a list of most common sources of data that we work with every day. And those include administrative, clinical registry data, EHR, text, images, and omics data. And all I have to say is that for us to really successfully work with any of these data sources, creative integration and this data sense, or like a spidey sense or intuition that we develop in working with data, are key to our success. So these are the four steps that we've developed every time we talk about working with data. So first of all, we scope out the sources of data that are available, and that requires a bit of creativity from time to time, and also knowing how much data is enough for a given purpose. We then curate data into information. So we create and sometimes have to validate new data elements. We need to know what really is in the data set and in each of the data sets that we plan on working with. And very importantly, an understanding of the pattern of missingness in the data set and whether missingness is at random or not is very important in working with any data set. Then we use the information to describe challenges and find solutions. And finally, we use technology and we use bioinformatics to help to implement those solutions clinically. So this is one of my favorite slides. We call it the data to intelligence or data to wisdom pyramid. And basically just demonstrates that data is really just the basic building block of anything that we want to work with. So we need to curate data into information, information to knowledge, to intelligence, and finally, wisdom. And it came from our recent textbook on artificial intelligence in cardiology and cardiac surgery. So then the fun begins. So these are just a few of the ways that we use data in research and in our daily lives. So predictive analytics is something that my group has a heavy focus on. And so we create clinical decision support tools to help diagnose and provide personal treatment for patients. And administratively, we use data to help with resource allocation and planning. We use data and machine learning techniques to help with our biomarker discovery series of studies. And finally, we encode the algorithms that we develop into applications. We sometimes build hardware to house the applications we develop. We had plans to integrate some of the algorithms and patented technologies we develop into wearable devices and EHR as well. So I want to give you some examples of how we use data in clinical and health services research. So like I said, I was raised with a group of cardiologists and cardiac surgeons. And so a lot of the research I'm going to show you during this segment of the presentation are going to be about ambulatory heart failure patients actually. But first, let's talk about biomarker and how we use big data techniques to work with biomarker data. So this is somewhat cardiac surgery related, and this really has to do with very early career stage for me. And so ever since I was a resident and I did a lot of moonlighting in CVICU, I realized how important right ventricular failure is. In perioperative course and also in the short and long-term prognosis of patients, especially those undergoing cardiac surgery. So for many decades now, we know that the RV is a forgotten ventricle. The LV gets all the attention, and RV is really just something that we don't pay as much attention to. And RV failure has this thing where it's tough to diagnose, it's tough to treat, and really, if you're proactive with it and you try to prevent it before its onset, that's really the best form of management. The problem with prevention is that most of the prediction models that have been developed clinically are no better than a coin toss in predicting RV failure because it's such a dynamic setting and it's so multifactorial. So, this is the very first small C grant I ever got as an attending. It was $50,000. And really, what we proposed to do is to build a biobank of patients who are at high risk of developing RV failure after bypass. And so with that, we did a number. We built a biobank of 350 patients that's still in a -80 freezer today, and we're still pulling samples from it and running tests with it. Um, and we discovered a number of novel biomarkers that are highly predictive of RV failure. So, you could measure those in a preoperative setting or right before separation from bypass. And those are actually clinically available. And so um, IGF-BP7 and NT-proBNP are among some of them. NGAL is sort of good, but not very great. And in a different setting, I would love to tell you more details about those. So like I said, we're still pulling samples from the biobank and we're still running proteomic analyses with those samples. And this is a paper that we're currently working on that basically tries to identify top three biomarkers using machine learning techniques from more than a panel, more than 500. And these biomarkers, only three of them combined together are according to any technique really, are very highly predictive of perioperative RV failure. So that's something we're very excited with. And all of this research has given us the ability to write a multidisciplinary consensus paper, with cardiac surgeons, cardiac anesthesia, intensivists, as well as heart failure cardiology on a consensus definition of perioperative RV failure. Because as some of you might know, part of the reason RV research hasn't really taken off is that it lacks a universal definition. So clinically, it's hard for us to make it into a quality metric because we don't know how to define it. And research-wise, it's even worse because if you can't even define an outcome and have a consensus-based definition, then all bets are off. So this is our intra and post-operative definition of RV failure in the context of cardiac surgery. And it did become one of the most highly cited papers in the European Heart Failure Society back in 2022. So enough about RV failure. Let's delve into heart failure in general. And so our general approach to this type of research is that we like to identify disparities. And if we are able to define which groups are at risk, then we can work with policymakers, clinicians, and administrators to design interventions to target those groups and actually improve outcomes. So this paper was, I think, one of the earliest papers that we published during my research career, and it had fairly far-reaching impact, through the New York Times, all through Europe and Asia. And basically, what we did was pretty simple. We took a 5-year period and we looked at all patients with an incident diagnosis of heart failure. And we found that, they're about equal split between men and women. However, the risk factors for developing heart failure in men and women are very different in that, these are the male risk factors. They look a lot more like a HFrEF, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction physiology, whereas in women, we get a lot of the age-related and also HFpEF type of risk factors. And what was also striking about this analysis was that, in this infographic, so basically the age standardized mortality rates had improved in both men and women, but it remained higher in women. And if you looked at hospitalization rates in the year subsequent to the heart failure diagnosis, it got better in men, but it stayed up in women. And so we were able to highlight this sex-based disparity. And so we followed this up with a 20-year period study, basically to see, has outcomes really improved over the last 2 decades in men versus women. And, in this slide, this is a slide really depicting 1 year survival after heart failure diagnosis in men. And you can see that each of these lines represents a 5-year period from 1994 to 2013. And basically, the outcomes has improved every 5 years in men. But if you look at this graph, it's pretty sad. It's a similar kind of concept, except it's for women. And you can see that there has been very little improvement in 1 year survival in women after they were diagnosed with heart failure. So sex is a problem, and women are higher risk. What about ethnicity? So this is a study that we soon after did with a group of French collaborators. And they're really interested in this is actually a group of anesthesiologists intensivists who are oddly very interested in acute heart failure admissions in general. And so what we did was we used a high performance surname based algorithm for identifying ethnicity. And this algorithm was really highly sensitive and specific in identifying South Asians and those with Chinese origin. And so what we did was that you can see that the green line is for South Asian. So survival in the year after your acute heart failure admission is actually the best in South Asians, and in part that's attributed to the fact that those patients are much younger. At the time that they're hospitalized, whereas Chinese general population, those lines pretty much overlap. Um, and when we really go in to look at what's going on within each of those groups, we found a very striking feature here in that, this is age standardized mortality rate in a year after heart failure admission. And if you look at the Chinese population, you can see that Chinese women are in a lot of trouble. So almost 3 times or, 2.5 times the age standardized mortality rate in Chinese women. If you look at South Asians, the trend is sort of opposite. Men are doing a little worse. In general population, not so much of a sex-based difference. So that's ethnicity. And this final study was actually sponsored by the government. So they basically said, hey, if you agree to do this study in our healthcare jurisdiction and help us identify a population that we could do outreach events on, um, then we'll fund your study and we'll actually fund your endeavors to target this population of interest. So we said, sure, what are you interested in? So they said, we're interested in patient sex because you guys did a bunch of studies on those, but we're also interested in the impact of rurality and access to care. So this is a 20-year study that we did. And the province of Ontario, there's a universal healthcare system, and it's basically governed by 14 LINs. LINs are local health integration networks. And so this is the Eastern Ontario LIN, where I used to work, and it's geographically a very large area, and there's a very diverse population that resides in this area. And so I really am just trying to highlight some of the key features of that paper. And what we found in that study was that, different diseases and different comorbidities don't have the same effect in urban dwellers versus rural dwellers, in that, valvular heart disease, dementia, and liver disease are not so much of a big deal in people who live in the urban area, whereas they're very deadly, along with metastatic cancer in those who live in rural areas. And so, with those findings and some of our previous findings, we were able to put together an outreach plan that a group of cardiologists were later able to adopt into practice. So And to wrap up this section of the talk, I just wanted to talk about personalized long-term risk prediction. And so this is a paper that we collaborated with that really builds on our previous findings. We knew that men and women had different heart failure risk factors, they had different outcomes. So we can't really afford to make a prediction model that's a one size that fits all. We needed to separate out men and women in terms of our predictive modeling. And so we were interested in diabetic patients, those who are first diagnosed with diabetes from day one. What's your risk of developing heart failure, and how many years from now will you be developing heart failure? So that's what this modeling was for. And to make it more powerful and more externally robust, we were able to derive those models in Canada and externally validate them using a primary care population in the UK. And this is cool because data elements are kind of different. Even the term diabetes, I mean, it sounds like diabetes, but they define it slightly differently in the UK than in Canada. So for us to be able to demonstrate that it actually validated very robustly in the UK, what was really cool. And these are some of the calibration plots. So, internal calibration in Ontario and external calibration in the UK. And you can see that, the closer those dots are to the dotted line, the closer the observed versus predicted, meaning our models validated very well, except for the highest risk decile of patients. So let's talk about cardiac surgery because that's really what I had signed up to do in this life clinically. And so we did use different data sources to look at disparities in cardiac surgical care, as well as to help to develop predictive strategies and to tailor interventions. So we started with disparities again. And this is a show and tell paper that I loved showing my colleagues and my trainees. And so what we did was that we took all patients who had isolated CABG surgery in Ontario, and we split them up according to heart failure phenotype. So you either have heart failure with preserved versus reduced ejection fraction. And the solid line is basically men, and the dotted lines are women. And so universally, you see that women have worse survival than men, regardless of which category you're in. And then if you look at ejection fraction in the presence of heart failure, ejection fraction is actually not as big of a predictor of outcome as the presence of heart failure itself. So you see how when we do handovers, we always say straightforward case, normal LV, done. This patient should do really well after surgery, should survive a long time after surgery. Well, not so much the case. If you have HFpEF, see your survival is this much worse than if you have reduced ejection fraction but no heart failure. And so when we delved into some of the explanatory factors for those findings, we found that women basically just presented in worse condition and in higher acuity for CABG than men. And they had a way higher incidence of poor outcomes within a year after cardiac surgery. So, they had higher incidence of MI, heart failure admission, more likely to be admitted to a nursing home, more likely to have stroke and dialysis, and so on. So then we did a study that covered all patients who had cardiac surgery. And what we found was that women were just in general much less likely than men to have cardiac surgery, especially surgery that has a revascularization component to it. And if you look at long term outcomes up to 9 or 10 years of follow up, you can see that women did worse than men. And these are adjusted curves. And so when we try to figure out what procedures women actually did worse than men, it really typically becomes CABG and CABG plus mitral valve surgery, in which women are at particularly higher risk. And we did a number of interesting subgroup analyses, and these are some of the interesting findings. Mitral valve surgery. So if you look at mitral repair, men did better than women in terms of survival over the long term. Whereas if you look at mitral replacement surgery, women actually did better than men. Aortic valve surgery, not much of a difference, women versus men, repair versus replacement. And so then we examined uh, sex differences or just any kind of subgroup of patients who might benefit from particular surgical techniques. So in these set of slides, I really focus on multiple arterial grafting for bypass surgery. We do have a series of studies looking at transcatheter versus open surgical repairs and so on, but multiple arterial grafting is a new sexy thing that many people are really starting to do more and more of. And we looked at sex differences in long-term outcomes after multiple arterial grafting. We actually found that over the intermediate and long term, multiple arterial grafting is beneficial in both women and men. But the problem with women is that women who had multiple arterial grafting had a much, much higher risk up front, right after surgery compared to men. And that warrants more attention. So we thought, okay, so there's a sex-based disparity. What about patients with particular comorbidities such as renal function? And so we looked at, in a comparative effectiveness study, patients with reduced versus preserved renal function who had single versus multiple arterial grafting procedures. And we found that in patients with moderately reduced renal function, GFR 30 to 60, there wasn't much of a difference in MACE outcomes, but those who had multiple arterial grafting uh, uh, did uh, did better uh, than those who had single arterial grafting. But in patients with GFR less than 30 or severely impaired preoperative renal function, patients who had multiple arterial grafting didn't exactly have a survival benefit, but they did have a MACE benefit. So we were interested in using data to conduct studies that are going to be very difficult to do in a randomized control trial. To give you an idea, the idea for this study was really to get ahead of a international RCT that I'm actually a co-investigator in, that's projected to take 7 to 8 years to recruit under 800 patients internationally, patients with severely reduced left ventricular function. And the purpose is really to compare whether CABG or PCI is the optimal strategy in those patients, because those patients are usually older, very complex. They will have a very high upfront risk. So a lot of the times the decision-making process is that let's get them over the perioperative period, help them survive. So let's do PCI instead of CABG. And so to be able to address the question of over the long term, who does better, we performed this population-based comparative effectiveness study. And we found that patients who had CABG did better in terms of survival as opposed to patients who underwent PCI. And this was true across a variety of subgroup analyses, including different types of stents, different generations of stents, and different grafting techniques for CABG. And we also found that across basically every secondary outcome, CABG patients did better. So, you can see that, incidence of cardiovascular death was higher in patients who had PCI. Incidence of MACE was higher. And the only thing where PCI patients did better was stroke, both upfront and over the long term. And so CABG patients did better in terms of lower incidence of revascularization. CABG patients had lower incidence of MI and a lower incidence of heart failure admissions after surgery. And so we're expanding this series of studies to include outcomes that are more relevant to patients, and that series of work is either under review or ongoing. So that is a nice prelude into patient-defined outcomes. So you heard about clinician-centric outcomes, you heard about patient-reported outcomes, and you heard about many different questionnaires, including the short-form questionnaires that are supposed to capture outcomes that are important to patients. But the problem here is that even the patient reported outcome questionnaires are derived by clinicians, and not all of the questions make sense to patients. And you often have to explain to them what it means, and they may not necessarily value every single item that's on the questionnaire. So, what do patients really care about? And so, this line of research, it all began with frailty. We were just stumbling across different multidimensional frailty instruments to be used in clinical administrative data. And, so we performed a study to look at the incidence of frailty who underwent cabbage surgery. And, this is an infographic that they made when this study was published. And we had a number of interesting findings. First of all, the incidence of frailty in the prevalence of frailty, rather, in cabbage patients is many-fold, probably about eightfold higher than any patients who underwent major high-risk non-cardiac surgery. So this is a very important population to look at. And then if you look at the center figure here, and basically what we're presenting is standardized mortality rates in patients who are frail versus non-frail across different age groups. And you can see that younger age and frailty don't go really well together, in that if you're in the young age group, age 40 to 64, you are pretty much twice as likely to die over the follow-up period after cabbage surgery. And this frailty-related mortality effect seems to lessen the older you get, to the point that if you're over the age of 65, there really isn't much of a mortality difference, whether you're frail or not. And this is important because I'm actually mentoring one of the farm residents, and we are about to, look at some pilot studies on prehabilitation before cardiac surgery. That's actually a protocol and a grant I was awarded before I left my previous institution. So that pilot project never really took off, but we wrote a whole protocol to target younger patients who had a considerable wait time before cardiac surgery, to be able to improve their outcome. So that study really helped us to find a highest yield study population for this type of thing. And this is a study that we did subsequently on all cardiac surgery types. So again, basically, to be frail is worse than not to be frail. And basically, mitral valve surgery and mitral plus aortic valve surgery are higher risk groups. This is an interesting plot that again demonstrate this age and frailty interaction, in that the younger the age, the higher the hazard ratio for death that's in association with frailty. And this effect really gets diluted over time, such that if you're 95 years old, the hazard ratio pretty much shrinks down to 1. So, from this line of work, we figured, well, if you're frail, then there's probably things that you're more afraid of that could happen to you after surgery than death itself. But exactly what are those things? So, we did a survey of more than 3,000 patients living with cardiovascular disease, and most of them had a cardiac procedure, either a PCI or LVAD or cardiac surgery of some sort. And we asked them a series of questions, and they were asked to weigh their preferences. So, a typical question would sound like, if you were to trade longevity in order to avoid a stroke, would you do that? And, can you rank things that are most important to you? And from that questionnaire, we were able to find that, sure, longevity is important for those patients, but to be free from stroke is actually even more important. And to be free from recurrent hospitalizations is very important. And to be free from nursing home admission is an important goal for most of those patients. So from that, we developed the concept of disability-free survival, which is a composite outcome encompassing those 3 points. And so this is initial run of data that we did, again, with different heart failure phenotypes. So we were able to see that if you have heart failure, regardless of what your ejection fraction is, your risk of getting disability as defined by recurrent hospitalization, as defined by stroke, or nursing home admission, is this much higher than people with reduced fraction but without heart failure symptoms before surgery. And this is like similar version of that diagram, but broken down by sex. So again, male are solid lines and females are dotted lines. And you can see that female, this yellow line, yellow dotted line, females with have PEF had the highest risk of disability in the year after surgery. So we looked at the incidence of disability across different types of cardiac surgery, and we were able to find that you know cabbage surgery, you get the lowest risk of disability, whereas cabbage plus multiple valves yields the highest incidence of disability after surgery. So this slide here is important for us because it really tells us that the outcomes we discuss with patients at the time we consent them for a certain procedure, say cardiac surgery, are really not as relevant as we think they may be. Because if you look at your risk of death in the year after surgery, well, it's about 3%. So it makes surgery really worth pursuing. But if you look at the risk of disability, it's about 6% in the year after surgery. And the combination of disability or death, it reaches almost 10%. So the risk is not insignificant, but it really depends on what that risk factor is you're looking at and how relevant it is to patients. So we were very proud of our disability outcome. We brought it to uh, CIHR, which is an NIH equivalent funding agency in Canada, for my very first grant. And we said we developed this really cool patient-centered outcome, and we want to validate it and do more work with it. And the first iteration, we got rejected. And the comments basically were, the idea is pretty cute, but the problem is that's all what the patients have to say. The clinicians had no input, and what do patients know about patient-centered outcomes? So we thought, okay, well, patients are important because it's supposed to be patient-centered, but what if we included a big panel of clinicians and caregivers in the mix just to make sure that, clinicians are able to balance their perspectives for patients and explain concepts better to patients, and the caregivers can help to balance out the social aspects of the burden of cardiovascular postoperative care. So we did that. We assembled a national panel with basically every specialty under the sun. We had general cardiology, we had heart failure cardiology, we had interventional cardiology, we had different cardiac surgeons involved, and we also had people from prevention and rehab. We had CVICU nursing, and we had cardiovascular psychologists. And we also had, of course, from our own team, CVICU intensivists and cardiac anesthesiologists. We went through few iterations of Delphi process, which culminated in an in-person meeting. And during that meeting, we basically distilled down a huge list of items into a 5-item composite outcome that we call PACE. So patient-centered adverse cardiac and non-cardiac cardiovascular events. And this includes severe stroke, ventilator dependence, new onset heart failure, nursing home admission, and new onset dialysis. So we then went on to apply this outcome in a series of research. So again, we're interested in comparing different frailty instruments and how well they predict outcomes. Because the problem is, as you know, clinically, there are a million clinical frailty scales. Some are multidimensional and some are unidimensional that just look at muscle strength or nutrition status or psychologic health. Some encompass more dimensions. In administrative data, is the same thing. So which one is better and in what scenario? So what we found, and the answer is what I used to hate so much as a trainee, and the answer is it depends. And so basically we looked at popular things like there's something called the Johns Hopkins ACG, Adjusted Clinical Groups. There's the Hospital Frailty Risk Score, which is born out of a Lancet paper published from a group in UK. And there's a perioperative frailty index. And so, these are just basically ROC curves at different time points after cardiac surgery. And you can see that consistently the hospital frailty risk score performed better. And this is at 2 years. But then at 5 years, things start to switch over in that the perioperative frailty index starts to take over as a higher performing thing. And that effect persisted and got much stronger at the 10-year mark. And so it really depends on at which time point you're trying to assess the outcomes and what outcomes you're looking at. And so, these are, the curves for PACE. We had a similar set of curves that run through time for mortality. And basically, performance of those scales were differential in a different way. So I don't know how much time we have left over, not very much. So let's run over health services research really quickly. And so health services research is an interesting field. It can be used to benchmark performance across a healthcare system. It can be used to assess teamwork and patient safety, to help with patient flow capacity management, and to assess practice variation. So this is a study we did. This is a model that's similar to the STS model that's widely used to benchmark performance of surgical programs in the US. We use data that's routinely collected and available in Ontario to make those report card measures. And so basically, these measures were used to adjudicate which programs did better over any given year across the whole province of Ontario. And sometimes funding allocation decisions were made based on their performance measurement. Um, During COVID, you know that in some healthcare systems, elective cases were canceled or postponed, which led to a lot of problems, including patients who are dying while waiting for their surgery. And so we developed using a combination of statistical methods and machine learning, and also incorporating three different models we developed to predict ICU hospital length of stay, as well as probability of death or unwanted hospitalization while waiting for surgery. We integrated those into a patented algorithm to help manage surgical workflow, and the resulting um, uh, work actually was used on a daily basis at my previous institution. And they were able to perform 95% of their usual cases, while the rest of Canada was down to 60% of their volume. And so that saved many millions of dollars from being clawed back. It also resulted in decreased use of ICU capacity, and while more cases were being done. And so a huge cost saving both ways. And so this is an idea of observed versus predicted performance for the waitlist model. Observed is the yellow and predicted is the black. And you can see they're pretty bang on. And same for hospital lengths of stay model that predicted actual number of days you're going to be in hospital after surgery. So we're validating this model actually at Stanford Healthcare right now to see if we could improve capacity and surgical workflow. And so, talking about flight of ideas, I'm just going to jump over to handover of anesthesia care. And you know that for administrators, you want to prevent burnout, you want the best patient outcomes possible. So, is handover really a good or bad thing? And so this is a series of studies, and we do have more papers down the pipeline. One of them just was accepted. And what we saw was that complete handover of anesthesia care, and after very careful statistical risk adjustment, was associated with higher risk of 1 year mortality after major cardiac surgery. We are interested in physician teamwork, and we're interested in whether the diversity of surgeon anesthesia team was associated with poor outcomes. So we started with a systematic review. We then did a population-based cohort study in cardiac surgery patients. We found that in cardiac surgery patients, if your physician team was sex concordant, and if you have an all male physician team, male surgeon, male anesthesiologist, your patients end up getting a longer length of stay after CABG surgery as compared to all female physician teams. But this observed effect is actually different when you apply to non-cardiac surgery. This is a more recent study we published in non-cardiac surgery. What we found was that sex discordant physician teams was associated with better perioperative patient outcomes. So more to come on that. So this is actually a topic that I really enjoy talking about, which unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to talk about, and that's hypotension. And that's one of my pet projects starting as a fellow, was to look at what thresholds and duration of hypotension were bad in non-cardiac and cardiac surgery. You know that hypotension is very common, is probably one of the only modifiable risk factors. We probably tolerate a lot more hypotension than we should as clinicians in critical care in the OR. And so exactly what defines hypotension, because overtreatment is also not good. And so this was my pet fellowship project. It was highly cited. And basically we looked at, what threshold and duration of hypotension are associated with acute kidney injury after non-cardiac surgery. We found that MAP less than 55 for any duration is bad, and MAP less than 60 was really bad. And this study, along with a couple others, are used as the basis for the Edwards Acumen advertisement, as well as a number of widely used metrics that actually define hypotension for quality purposes. So our group was also the first to perform a series of studies to exactly define hypotension threshold and duration for cardiac surgery. The uniqueness of our studies was that we separated out cardiac surgery into three distinct physiologic periods. We were looking at the pre-bypass period, the intra-bypass period, during which you have the bypass machine and you have non-pulsatile flow, in the post-bypass period, in which cardiac function is critical to your survival, and your heart, you're just freshly waking it up from a cardioplegic arrest. And so this is also a highly cited study where we looked at hypotension in association with stroke. And we actually found in this study that the during bypass period is critical for stroke. And we should always try to target a MAP of 65 or more during bypass. Whereas for acute kidney injury, the post-bypass period is most critical. And these are just some of the editorials, I think, that we wrote. And if you're looking at perioperative mortality, the post-bypass period is also critical. And so this is becoming a hot topic in cardiac surgery and in CVICU discussion forums and the literature. And basically, to summarize, MAP less than 65 for more than 10 minutes during bypass gives you higher risk of stroke. And if you're looking at AKI or new onset dialysis, you want MAP to target a MAP of more than 65 after bypass, and death, same thing after bypass. So now what can you do about it? And can you actually predict hypotension and the mechanism of hypotension so that you could prevent it? So that's where our work in big data and machine learning really sets in. And it also ties in my old skills in hardware engineering, in that we bought all those component devices on Amazon and assembled it on my kitchen table for the first prototype. It survived very well in when I was remotely testing it in my office, but clinically it wasn't sturdy enough. So the first device unfortunately died within the first 24 hours, just from being banged around by my clinician friends. So basically what we are trying to do though is that this is a touch screen device where you could personally tailor the MAP threshold that you want to keep your patient at based on their underlying physiology, where you think their cerebral autoregulation curve is, and it will predict the actual blood pressure value, your actual MAP value, up to 30 minutes from now and give you appropriate warning messages. And so to give you an idea, this is a HL7 message, and we have basically hundreds of thousands, if not millions of those, because those can come out every 15 seconds to a minute from your electronic health record. And from this, we basically distill down, identify the right headers, and get the map or any kind of hemodynamic information we want. This is device in action, but I'm not sure if it actually works here. Yeah, so this is actually a recorded loop of a patient's blood pressure, and this just basically demonstrates the different warning lights by how close the episode is going to be and how bad the hypotension is going to be. Because my problem with the Edwards Acumen device is that if your map is going to be 64, it's going to tell you that hypotension coming up. But 64, 65 was the difference. Whereas if the map is going to be 30, then for sure, even now I'm going to start doing something about it. So we got alarm fatigue pretty quickly. These are the warning email messages, and I had to create a separate email inbox for the warning messages of upcoming hypotension episodes. I got very quickly tired of it because I was literally getting thousands within hours. We only hooked it up to 5 CVICU beds, but just to give you an idea. So we're still working on the alarm part, but that was a lot of fun when we played with it. So thank you. I sort of went over, but for whatever time is left over, I'm happy to take questions.
I have a mic. I can come to you if you have questions. Okay.
Thank you, Louise. In one of your last slides, you talked about hypotension related to kidney injury and stroke. Was that measured at normothermia, or, we, especially at Stanford, we often cool even for non-circ arrest cases. So I was curious if it's measured in which temperature.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, the non-cardiac surgery one would be normothermic, but the cardiac surgery study is an interesting thing because even the centers that I've been to, they all have different temperature practices, so this is a single center retrospective cohort study, and so it's really subjected to that center's practice patterns. I would say half of the surgeons would let patients passively drift down to 35 degrees, maybe 34. The other half will be keeping the patient normothermic at 36 degrees. So it does not involve cooling. We did, I advised in a study that is recently being written up that uses STS data, the lowest bypass temperature and its association with acute kidney injury. And it actually produces findings that may contradict your intuitive understanding of temperature and kidney protection. So.
Louise, I very much enjoyed this talk. Thank you. And I'm grateful that I got to watch you present similar at the STA meeting this past year in Toronto. I'm curious, from your pretty influential position defining what metrics we should be paying attention to, how do you see the future with it integrating into our kind of database organizations that tell us what we should be paying attention to, like MPOG or STS? Like, I don't think we're there yet with integrating what you're pointing out is important and with what the databases are saying is important. When will we get there?
Right. So that's a very good question. And, thank you for that. The answer is we're probably not very close to personalizing this threshold. And I think, the problem is that I think for cardiac surgery is one thing, and people generally are not ready to make cardiac surgery specific metrics available. For non-cardiac surgery, that there's this forever debate of absolute versus relative hypotension thresholds. I thought we had closed the debate for good a couple of years ago. And, I used to get on those panels and we would get red in the face and never finish the debate. But basically empiric thresholds is as good as those, relative thresholds according to a number of studies. But people still have trouble, I think, letting go of the concept of relative thresholds. So, exactly what map targets are good. I think it'll just require the experts to agree. And recently, the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation, put together an expert consensus panel. So again, we were in a really stuffy room for 48 hours, argued till we were red in the face. I actually led the section that defined hypotension, and it took us maybe 8 hours in a room. We couldn't even agree on how to define hypotension. And a lot of our statements were still probably, most likely, we recommend, as opposed to this is the way it is. Ron. Mhm. Right, for sure. And, that's a great question, Ron. And I think my studies could generally be classified into two things, right? So, the more precision-based studies where we use detailed registry type databases, we have details such as duration of bypass, what temperature patients were kept at, and, what drugs were given, what inotropes were on in the OR and in the ICU. And there's population-based studies that obviously lack that level of detail. And I think I would say that some of what we do, especially in terms of unwanted perioperative complications, do definitely have an influence, and we're able to look at those within hypotension or similar studies that haven't had a chance to present. But I think we're probably quite a ways away from personalizing perioperative management based on that. And I just simply don't think precision-based data is accessible enough to most clinicians and researchers for us to do that type of work. And also, the rate at which we're accumulating data, and the rate at which we're making data available and accessible don't really match up, unfortunately.
Thanks, Dr. Sun. I have a very small question about your hypotension predictive device, we'll call it.
Sure.
I'm familiar with a similar technology that I think is out of Michigan, which is for non-cardiac surgery. And it's not using HL7 codes. It's directly off of an A line, so it's live data. And the sensitivity of that prediction index to noise on the A line signal is greater than the predictive index of the device based on real data. To what extent can your device filter out aberrant signal based on what is like lagging HL7 codes?
Yeah.
Or does that matter?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because what I didn't have time to delve into, when we're trying to commercialize this thing, it's a patented technology, and when we try to commercialize this, we have extensive slides demonstrating signal to noise ratio and how we filter it out. And how we do it actually went back to the days when we started working with hypotension data, just defining hypotension thresholds, in that we had cardiac surgery and non-cardiac surgery specific algorithms for filtering out what might be an artifact. And if we had, say, 4 to 6 readings during a minute, we would actually opt to select the best or most accurate reading out of that minute. And so we actually had an algorithm for that, because I totally get it. I think, the signal gets dampened, or there's an air bubble in the tubing, or you suddenly drop the transducer to the floor, so your pressure looks like it went up to 300 all in a sudden. And when you're sampling, right? So there's like a number of ways to produce artifacts, and we did have ways of dealing with it. You're right. The algorithm that we developed was really good at predicting even the occasional artifacts, but we actually removed, I would say, about 90 to 95% of the artifacts before we even started processing it to develop the algorithm itself.
Louise,
Sure.
thank you. That was awesome.
Thanks so much.
Everyone that belongs to the Division of Cardiac Anesthesia, please hang back for about 2 minutes. Thank you.